My name is Anna, and I'm the mother of 6-year-old Jake. We live in a small house on the outskirts of the city. Life was peaceful until my husband left us 2 years ago. Since then, I've been raising my son on my own, and we try to stay close despite the challenges. Jake is a quiet, calm child who loves to draw and play in his room. But everything changed when he started talking to an imaginary friend. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. Children often create imaginary friends, especially if they're lonely. Jake named him Max. He said Max lived in the closet in his room and that he was very kind. I smiled while listening to his stories and was even glad that my son had such a friend. But then things got strange. One evening, I heard Jake talking in his room. I peeked inside and saw him sitting on the bed with an empty chair in front of him. He was talking animatedly, gesturing as if someone was really sitting there. I asked, "Who are you talking to?" He looked at me with his big eyes and said, "To Max, Mom. He wants to meet you." This made me a little uneasy, but I decided it was just a child's imagination. However, over the next few days, I noticed that Jake became more withdrawn. He stopped playing with his toys, stopped drawing. Instead, he spent hours sitting in his room, whispering to Max. One day, I heard him shouting, "No, Max, don't." I rushed into his room and saw that Jake was sitting on the floor and his arm had bruises. He said he fell by himself, but I didn't believe him. That same night, I woke up to a strange sound. Someone was whispering in the hallway. I left the room and saw that Jake's door was ajar. I peeked inside and saw that my son was sleeping, but on the chair by his bed sat a shadow. It wasn't just the shadow of the light, it was thick, almost tangible. I froze, unsure of what to do. The shadow turned towards me, and I felt chills run down my spine. I slammed the door shut and returned to my room, trembling with fear. The next morning, I asked Jake who Max was. He looked at me and said, "He's my friend. He says you shouldn't be afraid of him. He wants to help us." I tried to explain to him that Max wasn't a real person, but he insisted that Max was real. He even showed me drawings they had made together. The pictures depicted strange figures, resembling people, but with distorted faces. I decided to talk to a psychologist. She said this could be a reaction to stress from the divorce and recommended I spend more time with Jake. I followed her advice, but nothing changed. On the contrary, Max became more insistent. One day, I heard Jake crying in his room. I went in and saw him sitting in the corner with a broken picture frame of his father in front of him. Max said that Daddy left us and he's never coming back, Jake said, staring at me with empty eyes. I started to get scared. I felt something wasn't right, but I couldn't understand what it was. One night, I woke up to someone shaking me by the shoulder. I opened my eyes and saw Jake standing next to my bed, looking at me. "Mom, Max wants to talk to you," he said. I tried to calm him down, but he insisted. I followed him to his room, and there, in the corner, I saw him. Max. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a person, but his face was distorted, just like the drawings Jake had made. He smiled at me, and I felt the cold seep into my chest. "You have to leave," he said, his voice hoarse as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. I grabbed Jake and ran out of the room. We spent the night in the living room, and the next morning, I decided we needed to leave the house. But Max wouldn't let us go. He followed us. Jake saw him everywhere. In the car, at the store, on the street. He said Max was angry and wanted us to come back. I didn't know what to do. I turned to a priest, but he said it wasn't his issue. I felt like I was losing control of the situation. One night, I woke up to Jake's scream. I rushed into his room and saw him standing in front of the mirror, and in the reflection was Max. He was smiling and holding Jake's hand. "He's mine now," Max said. I grabbed my son and ran out of the house. We got in the car and drove as far as we could. Now we live in another city, but I know Max is still nearby. Jake no longer talks about him, but sometimes I see him staring into the emptiness, whispering something. I don't know what to do. I'm afraid that one day, Max will take him away forever. After we fled the house, I decided to learn more about what was happening. I started by contacting the previous owners of the house. It turned out that the house was sold to us through an agency, and before us, a family with a child had lived there. I found their contact information and called them. The woman who answered didn't want to talk at first, but when I mentioned the name Max, she fell silent and then quietly said, "Do you see him too?" We arranged to meet. Her name was Olivia, and she told me a story that sent chills down my spine. It turned out that her son, Max, had died in that house 10 years ago. He was 6 years old, just like Jake is now. He was a quiet, withdrawn child who often talked about a friend who lived in the closet. Olivia and her husband didn't pay much attention to it until one day Max disappeared. They searched for him all over town but couldn't find him. A week later, his body was discovered in the forest near the house. The official version was an accident, but Olivia had always suspected something wasn't right. After Max's death, strange things began happening in the house. Objects moved on their own. Footsteps were heard at night, and once, Olivia saw the shadow of her son standing in the hallway. They decided to sell the house and leave. "He doesn't want to leave," Olivia said, looking at me with tired eyes. "He's looking for a friend. He's lonely." I started digging deeper. It turned out the house had been built on the site of an old, abandoned cemetery. Local people said the place had always been unclean. I found an old woman who had lived in the area her whole life. She told me that many children had been buried at the cemetery, children who had died from diseases in the past century. Their souls couldn't find peace because their graves had been destroyed when the houses were built. "Max isn't the only one," she said. "There are many of them. They look for friends among living children so they won't be lonely." I realized that Max had chosen Jake because he was lonely after his father left. Max felt his pain and loneliness, and that's what drew him to him. He wanted to replace Jake's father, to be his friend, anyone.
Synopsis. The Thompson family ventures into Lekezersk, an abandoned mining town where every resident vanished without a trace in the 1980s. Instead of ruins, they find a place frozen in time. Shadows flicker in windows, a cafe serves steaming coffee, and echoes of the past hum through empty streets. But as the town begins to awaken, reality unravels. Their memories fade, old photographs reveal their own faces among long-dead locals, and escape routes vanish. To survive, they must navigate a cursed mine that promises freedom, or traps them forever. Can they outrun a town that feeds on memory, or will they become ghosts of its haunting legacy? The Thompson family, father Alex, mother Emily, their 16-year-old daughter Sophie, and 10-year-old son Max, decided to spend their weekend in an unusual way. Instead of their usual countryside retreat, they stumbled upon an article online about an abandoned town called Lekezersk. Once a thriving mining settlement, all its inhabitants had mysteriously disappeared in the 1980s. The town had since become a destination for lovers of the paranormal and urban explorers. The article was filled with photos of empty streets, crumbling houses, and eerie stories about the city that remembers. "Well, shall we take the risk?" Alex asked with a smile, showing the article to his wife. "Why not?" Emily replied. "The kids will find it interesting. Only if there are no ghosts," Sophie added jokingly, though a slight tremble in her voice betrayed her unease. "There's no such thing as ghosts," Max declared confidently, though his eyes sparkled with curiosity. The road to nowhere. The drive to Lekezersk took several hours. The closer they got, the more desolate the landscape became. The surrounding forest was dense and gloomy, and the road leading to the town was cracked and overgrown with weeds. Finally, they saw a rusted sign, Lekezersk, 2 kilometers. "Here we are," Alex said, stopping the car on the outskirts of the town. The town greeted them with silence. The The streets were empty, the houses were half ruined, and the air was filled with a strange, almost tangible stillness. "Well, shall we start exploring?" Emily suggested, pulling out her camera. The first oddities. At first, everything seemed normal. They took photos of the old buildings, peered through empty windows, and laughed at Max, who was too scared to go inside. But then Sophie noticed something strange. "Mom, Dad, did you see that?" she asked, pointing to the window of one of the houses. "What?" Alex asked. "There's a light in the window." Everyone turned to look. In one of the houses on the second floor, a light was indeed glowing. "Probably just a reflection," Alex said uncertainly, though doubt crept into his voice. A few minutes later, they heard footsteps. Someone was walking down the street, but there was no one in sight. "It's probably the wind," Emily said, though her voice trembled. The cafe that shouldn't be. When they reached the center of the town, their attention was drawn to a small cafe. The sign above the entrance read, "Cozy." The windows were intact, and a light was on inside. "This can't be," Emily whispered. "The town's been abandoned for 40 years. Maybe someone decided to restore it," Alex suggested, though he didn't believe it himself. They went inside. The cafe looked as if it had just opened. Vases of flowers sat on the tables, and a coffee pot steamed on the counter. "Is anyone here?" Alex called out. There was no response. Max walked up to the counter and touched the coffee pot. "It's hot," he exclaimed. "This can't be," Emily repeated, but her words were cut off by the sound of a bell ringing above the door. They turned around, but no one was there. The town comes alive. From that moment on, the oddities began to escalate. Shadows started appearing on the streets, silhouettes flickered in the windows of houses, and music from the 80s suddenly began playing from the cafe's radio. "We need to leave," Emily said, but Alex interrupted her. "We can't just leave. We need to figure out what's going on here." They decided to explore a few more houses. In one of them, they found an old photo album. The photos showed people who looked exactly like them. "That's us," Sophie whispered, pointing to a photo of the family sitting at a table in the same cafe. "But that's impossible," Alex said, though his voice trembled. "The town takes their memories." Suddenly, Max began to cry. "I don't remember how we got here," he said. "What do you mean?" Emily asked. "I don't remember getting in the car or driving here. I don't remember anything." Emily tried to calm her son, but then she realized that she, too, couldn't recall the details of their trip. Sophie also began to lose her memories. "This town, it's taking our memories," she said. "We have to leave before it's too late," Alex said. The attempt to escape. They rushed to the car, but the road they had come on was gone. In its place was an endless forest. "This can't be," Alex shouted. "Dad, look." Max pointed to an old map hanging on the wall of one of the houses. It showed a path leading out of the town. "It's a trap," Sophie said. "But we have no choice." They followed the path. The town around them continued to come alive. Lights turned on in the windows. People appeared on the streets, but their faces were blurred and their voices were silent. The finale. Finally, they reached an old mine on the outskirts of the town. A sign hung above the entrance, "Exit." "This is our chance," Alex said. "What if it's a trap?" Emily asked. "We have no other choice." They entered the mine. Inside, it was dark and cold. After a few minutes, they saw a light at the end of the tunnel. When they emerged, they found themselves back where they had left the car. Did we make it out?" Emily asked. "It seems so," Alex replied. But as they got into the car, Max suddenly said, "Who are Sophie and Emily?" Alex turned around. The back seat was empty. "Emily?" "Sophie," he called out, but there was no response. The town had taken them. And now Alex and Max would have to return to save them, even if it meant becoming a part of Le Kezers forever.